And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
You won't believe it, but America, which once fed the whole world, is now losing hope for the future. Right now, in the heart of the country, cornfields are burning, farmers are closing their farms, and once bustling cities are becoming empty. This is not a drought, a flood, or an invasion of pests. The world has turned its back on American corn, and no one wants to buy what was once considered the country's gold. Containers of corn are being sent back to Iowa and Illinois, contracts with Asia and Europe are being cancelled, and farmers are hearing nothing but silence from the banks.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
No one is picking up the phone to help. Iowa, which once stabilized world food prices, has lost more than 40% of its exports in a year. Canada and Brazil are taking over markets where the US was recently the leader, and American farmers are left with no buyers and no way to survive.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
Every week, at least one medium-sized farm closes in Iowa because there is no one left to sell to. Farm stores are closed, fairs are empty, and banks are moving from lending to foreclosures. An old farmer says that the government once spent billions to support the agricultural sector, but now they don't even answer the phone.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
In California, which once produced a third of all U.S. agricultural products, there are now abandoned fields, rusting irrigation systems, and people who are forced to leave, leaving behind a void. In the Central Valley, 30% of farms have been abandoned in just 3 years. Old folks in Fresno say they have land but no water and no faith. And even if they plant, it's not profitable to sell. And if they don't plant, bankruptcy is the only option. At the same time, Canadian corn, duty-free and supported by the government, is taking over the markets of Japan, Korea, China, and Europe, where American grain used to go.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
In Nebraska, once a symbol of new life and rural stubbornness, farms are closing without fanfare or scandal. People are leaving, old houses are emptying, and snow is falling on abandoned fields where there are no longer even traces of tractors. Canadian companies are buying up American land, investment funds are buying Texas acre by acre, and flags that once symbolized freedom now hang on broken fences next to land for sale signs. America is losing its fields, its food security, and its pride. Today, we will ask the main question: what has happened to America if even corn is no longer needed here? Why are farmers who have held this land for generations now forced to leave? Why is Canada becoming the new grain superpower, while America is left with no markets and no hope? This video is not just about agriculture. It is the story of a country that is changing quietly without the chance to say goodbye. Listen carefully because your state could be next.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
America, once considered the breadbasket of the world, is now turning into a country where golden cornfields are turning to ash and farmers with trembling hands are signing bankruptcy papers. Thousands of people who have held onto their land for generations no longer see the point in continuing when the world has turned its back on American products, and even their own government is slowly and indifferently watching them collapse. The world no longer wants American corn in its ports. Containers that left Iowa and Illinois are now returning like unwanted trash. Contracts that were supposed to sustain entire states are burning, leaving behind only the ashes of broken promises.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
According to the Agricultural Protection Agency, corn exports from Iowa have fallen by 43% over the past year, the sharpest decline in 50 years. But these are official figures. Unofficially, farmers say they have lost up to 70% of their real income, given the rising prices of fertilizers, fuel, and transportation, which are eating away at any profits. There are no more excuses to be made. Local banks are refusing to lend to farmers and are moving to seize land for debt, while insurance companies are cutting payments en masse under the pretext of changes in weather risks. In a small town near Des Moines, all the farm stores and fairs have closed in just 2 years. People have stopped buying equipment and seeds because there is no point in sowing if no one is going to buy the harvest. Local roads are overgrown with grass and houses stand empty because young people have left to find work in the cities, while the elderly remain to die alone, surrounded by overgrown fields.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
But even worse, Canada and Brazil are taking over markets that belonged to the US just yesterday. They are sending corn to Japan, South Korea, and China, while American products are being sent back or sitting in warehouses because new sanitary standards and quotas make exports unprofitable. Canadian corn, subsidized by the government and shipped via new sea routes through Halifax, is cheaper and faster to deliver. While America argues over tariffs and budgets, Canadian farmers have already signed long-term contracts with Asian giants. In reality, the situation has gone so far that in some counties in Iowa, farmers are harvesting their crops and leaving them to rot in silos because shipping them to the nearest port would cost more than the corn itself. One farmer who had been growing corn for 40 years admitted that for the first time in his life, he burned his field to save on harvesting costs because he couldn't find a buyer, even at the minimum price.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
But the disaster is not limited to Iowa. Illinois, which has always prided itself on its ports on the Mississippi, is becoming a graveyard for corn contracts. In the first quarter of 2025, corn exports from Illinois fell by 55% compared to 2022. The giant elevators in Cairo and Granite City are now operating at only 40% of their capacity, while the rest stand empty, rusting and slowly filling with rats. And it's not that farmers have stopped growing corn. They continue to work, getting into debt, hoping that the market will return. But it is not returning. European buyers have switched to Ukrainian wheat and Canadian corn, and Asia has signed new contracts with Brazil. American products have become too expensive and logistics too slow. One farmer from Peoria County said that his contracts with Germany, which had been in place for 12 years, were cancelled in one day because a new supplier offered a price 20% lower and free delivery.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
But even these problems seem minor compared to what is happening to the people themselves. Behind the facade of fields and numbers of families who are losing their homes, their faith, and their future. Young families are breaking up because they cannot even afford to pay their loans for equipment, let alone live a normal life. Children are leaving to study and never returning. Dozens of small towns in Illinois and Iowa have turned into ghost towns, where the occasional truck passes by carrying the remains of those who have finally given up. Even farmers who previously refused to accept government aid on principle are now standing in line for food stamps to feed their families. And all this is happening against a backdrop of fine words about supporting farmers, innovation, and the future of agriculture. Government officials promise new support programs, but these programs either do not reach their intended recipients or are so small that they are only enough to fill a tractor with fuel once. Against the backdrop of real losses, this money looks like a mockery. There are rumors that in some counties in Iowa and Illinois, farmers have begun to form secret alliances to sell their crops for cash, bypassing middlemen, and at least in this way save their families from ruin. But even this does not save them from debt and the threat of losing their land because taxes, loans, and insurance continue to strangle those who still cling to hope. This is not just a story about agriculture. It is a story about the destruction of the very heart of America, when the fields that fed the world are becoming a symbol of oblivion. When no one wants American corn and farmers are abandoning their fields, it means that America is losing more than just food. It is losing its identity, its strength, and what made it a great country. And if even the strongest farmers in Iowa and Illinois are giving up, what about the other states? The silence of the departing farmers is far more frightening than any news of crises and wars, because it slowly but surely shows that the country can no longer take care of itself. And while Canada, Brazil, and other countries are taking over the markets, America is silently watching its future slip away, and no one can say when or how it will end. While Iowa and Illinois are already suffocating from returned corn containers, California is dying in its own way, but just as quietly. Its once green valleys, where hundreds of tractors and combines used to pass through every day, now look more like stone-scorched wastelands. The Central Valley, once considered the heart of American agriculture, has lost a third of all farms specializing in corn and feed crops in 3 years. But it's not just the heat and drought that are taking away farmers' hope. State policies with endless inspections, new fertilizer requirements, and taxes on water and land are literally squeezing the last funds out of people to pay their bills. An old farmer from Fresno County said that he now pays 3 times more for irrigation water than for land rent, and even if he harvests his crops, the profits will still go to pay the bills, not to feed his family. At the same time, another enemy is growing in California, Canadian and Brazilian corn. Thanks to government subsidies and cheap labor, these countries are driving American farmers out of the markets of Japan, South Korea, and China. These countries used to buy large quantities of feed corn and grain from California, supporting tens of thousands of families, but now they are signing long-term contracts with Canada, where prices are 20% lower, and delivery is via new sea routes through Halifax and Canadian Pacific ports, which the US can no longer beat in terms of speed and price. The reasons given for rejecting American grain, such as new phytosanitary requirements, have become nothing more than a tool to reject more expensive supplies, which are being quietly replaced by Canadian corn. From 2021 to 2025, US corn shipments to Asia fell by 50%, while Canadian shipments nearly doubled, capturing markets and connections that America had built over decades. But there is something that official reports are silent about. According to an independent California Farmers Association, more than 15% of former corn exporters have already switched to part-time jobs in IT or logistics to avoid starvation, and more than 2,000 families have sold their land to Canadian funds that are buying up farms for next to nothing, leaving Americans with no chance of returning to the agricultural sector. In Nebraska, where farmers used to build their lives for generations, there is now absolute silence, in which you can hear the rusting of fences and empty feeders swaying in the wind. People once moved to Nebraska for a fresh start, cheap land, and a community that helped each other, but now even the most stubborn are giving up because they cannot fight three enemies at once: the lack of a market, rising costs, and the bankruptcy of the infrastructure around them. Lack of access to seaports, expensive transportation, outdated warehouses, and slow delivery speeds have made Nebraska a loser in the battle with Canada and Brazil. Over the past 4 years, the largest agricultural holdings that once bought corn in Nebraska have moved their bases to Canada, where tax breaks and cheap logistics allow them to make money, even at low prices. Statistics show that 27% of farms have been abandoned in 2 years, but farmers claim that the actual figure is closer to 40% if you include farms that are uncultivated but not yet sold. Among the fictional but true-to-life stories is one about a former farm owner in Lexington who spent last Christmas alone in his house, surrounded by 3 empty warehouses and miles of snow-covered fields that have not been cultivated for 2 years. Canadian funds bought his neighbor's land, and now the same corn grows there as before. But for the Canadian economy, not for America. The same shadow is slowly creeping into Kansas, a state where farming has always been more than just a business, but a way of life, a culture, and a tradition. 90% of the land here is used for agriculture, and every family was once connected to farming in one way or another. But since 2023, wheat exports from Kansas to Europe and North Africa have fallen by 60%, not because the quality has deteriorated, but because Ukrainian wheat and Canadian corn have become cheaper and more accessible, and logistics from Kansas have become uncompetitive. Kansas farmers are forced to sell their fields at a loss, or take out loans to pay at least their land taxes, which continued to rise even during the crisis. Last year alone, the unemployment rate in rural Kansas doubled because several large grain processing plants closed and thousands of people lost their jobs. At the same time, while farmers in Kansas and Nebraska are selling off their equipment to pay their debts, Canadian traders continue to sign new export contracts and buy fertilizers and equipment at prices that are unaffordable to Americans. And while US government reports speak of stability, in reality young families are leaving these regions, leaving behind empty houses and fields that will soon be overgrown with weeds. But what even independent reports fail to mention is that, according to rumors, several large Canadian agricultural holdings registered through offshore companies are buying up farmland in Nebraska and Kansas through shell companies, preparing a platform for the creation of a new export empire on US territory, where American farmers will work on foreign land for wages, growing crops for the same markets that once belonged to America. Thus, while Canada is winning the war for markets with subsidies and sophisticated logistics, American farmers in California, Nebraska, and Kansas are losing not only their fields but also their faith in the future. And although on paper America can still feed itself behind closed bank doors in lines for subsidies and in empty grain silos, it is becoming clear that the country that once fed the world is now losing a silent and terrible war for its agriculture, unaware that a competitor who speaks the same language is already taking away markets, land, and the future of American farmers. When farmers in Iowa and California have already given up, and Nebraska and Kansas are disappearing into the silence of abandoned fields, the next in line are states where people are still trying to fight, but every day that fight becomes more and more meaningless. Missouri, Indiana, Illinois, these names once meant stability, perseverance, and bread on American tables. But today, only the ruins of hope remain, as three enemies: taxes, expenses, and climate line up against those who still believe that the land cannot be betrayed. In Missouri, farmers who once saw themselves as guardians of tradition and community are now forced to put not only their finances, but their families at risk every season. Fertilizer is getting more expensive, fuel eats up half the budget, and unpredictable weather kills any attempt at planning. The seasons are changing, but not like they used to. Farmers used to wait for rain and warmth. Now they wait for at least a month without extreme precipitation or drought. The government offers assistance, but this assistance comes in the form of symbolic checks that are more like a mockery than real support. One farmer from Boone County said that crop insurance has become another trap. Now, because of new standards, he has been denied payments even though his field was literally washed away by rain 3 days before harvest.